In this section, we will focus on the individual application of load on a locomotor system in the sports training. Many athletes end their careers prematurely due to the repetitive, improper loading of the locomotor system. Over time, this creates complications within the joint, which can result in serious injury. In practice, training is focused on building muscle volume and strength through isolated movements of individual muscles while joints are in decentralized position. Postural stabilization is insufficient when muscle imbalances appear and pathological patterns of movement are reinforced during the learning process of muscle training, with the excessive overload of the musculoskeletal system. This commonly results in injuries and subsequently pain. In the following video, we will demonstrate the importance of postural stabilization while applying a load to the locomotor system. Proper training not only protects the musculoskeletal system, but also improves other parameters such as muscle strength, coordination, timing, and speed to enhance movement quality. The postural control system is a functional unit. It is activated prior to any activity, under any static load, as well as any targeted upper and lower limb movement. Proper perception of position and movement in individual joints, as well as the activity of relevant muscles, lead to a correct understanding of their function and interconnection. In other words, we can say that we do not aim to train muscles, but to rewire the central nervous system. Targeted activation of certain brain areas that are in charge of awareness, sensory perception analysis, and connection with motor functions are crucial. In practice, it is crucial to train conscious perception of one's own body while repeated, precise, simple movements during active exercise. The client strives for a maximum understanding of positioning and movement. The stabilizing function of the body's torso is necessary for the correct execution of all exercises. This can be trained very well in undifferentiated positions. Undifferentiated positions are positions in which the limbs perform the same task. Both sides of the body work in the same phase or support mode. Push-ups, squatting, weightlifting, and jumping are some examples of undifferentiated positions. In practice, the term functional or core training is often encountered. To fulfill the meaning of functional training, instructions in each position need to stick to clear rules followed in correct order. There are 3 basic rules to follow. First, setting the centrated position. Second, activation of trunk stabilization. Third, subsequent dynamic or static loading. Three months supine position. This is a position we often use at the beginning to train and to reinforce the principles just described. The first step is to engage the centrated position, so-called positioning. In order to find the centration of the joints, you will need to understand the neutral position and the right support. The support in the 3-month position has a shape of a diamond. The diamond shape starts at the nuchal line, which is located on the back of the head where the neck muscles insert, and continues through the shoulder blade ridges and terminates in the area of the lower back. As soon as we manage to set the individual segments properly and center them, we can achieve faster coordinated and balanced activation of the core muscles. A centered position of the head, chest, and pelvis is crucial for the proper function of the diaphragm, and therefore it is the starting point for correction of the trunk posture. When trunk stabilizing function is lost, the body is disengaged, and the quality of movement diminishes, ultimately exposing the joints to the risk of damage and the muscles to the risk of overload. Prior to any activity, even the simplest movements, trunk stabilization must be achieved. Loading through either dynamic motion or endurance training using resistance and pressure is the third basic step. For this, we can use movement of either upper or lower limbs or combination of both. One of the exercises that focuses on the trunk and upper limbs is the floor press. The exercise is based on engagement of the trunk to provide support in the area of the shoulder blades. Here we focus on the isolated movement in the joints of the upper limbs without improper co-activation of the trunk muscles. The movement of the upper limbs comes from the shoulder joints. We keep the thoracic and lumbar spine in contact with the mat or floor throughout the movement. The most common mistake we encounter is due to a lack of endurance, ultimately rendering the joints in a decentrated position with elevation of the chest as well as increased retroflexion in the lumbar region. In an optimal execution of floor presses, we shall find the abdominal wall in a cylindrical shape with a balanced activation of all parts of the abdominal wall muscles. Quite often, however, we observe the unbalanced or asymmetrical activity with predominant activation of the upper part of the rectus abdominis and possible diastasis or separation of the abdominal muscles. In the so-called disengagement, when the abdominal muscles do not hold the chest in the centered position and there is not enough support in the area of the shoulders, we see decentration of the shoulder joints associated with overload of the upper portions of the pectoral and trapezius muscles. French pullover, similarly to the previous exercise, the client must pay attention to the quality of trunk stabilization throughout the movement. The movement now takes place in the elbow joints, which stretch and bend in isolation. Both exercises can be performed with slightly bent or raised lower limbs. In the variant with raised lower limbs, the legs act as a load. We always pay attention to the connection of upper and lower parts of the trunk. The upper limbs lift the barbell in isolation again. Another variant of this exercise is the isolated movement of the upper limbs behind the head with a kettlebell. The aim is to isolate the shoulder girdle. The trunk remains perfectly stable and does not escape from the neutral position and creates a fixed point for the upper limbs to work. The most common mistake is uneven trunk stabilization with the chest migrating towards the head when lifting the kettlebell behind the head. The same principle of trunk stabilization also applies to the upper limb while working with a medicine ball. To lift the upper body, with or without load, it is essential to create a fixed point on the pelvis to which the upper half of the body rises smoothly. We can also use a swinging motion when throwing the medicine ball, which requires more precise trunk muscle interaction to maintain the abdominal wall's cylindrical shape during all phases of throwing and catching of the medicine ball. We can also train with modifications of passing the medicine ball from upper to lower limbs. Another exercise for the upper limbs is pushing against resistance using the palms of one's hands. For this, one can use the lower part of a table. Pushing the palms against the table while maintaining and using proper support of the upper body allows one to achieve proper support through the shoulder blades. Exercises focused on the trunk and lower limbs. By increasing the pressure towards the hip joints in the direction of the long axis of the femur, it is possible to optimize the distribution of muscle tension in the abdominal wall. This allows for the ideal involvement of the thigh muscles and the hip joint. In the aircraft position, the trainer can assist to stabilize the trunk and the limbs of the client by applying pressure on the lower limb joints. When the trainer touches the ribs of the client, it helps the chest to move downwards so that the upper and lower body are correctly aligned. At the same time, it is important to control the position of the shoulder blades on the mat, since the shoulders tend to protract. By pressing against the palms, we increase awareness and proprioception of the support region between the shoulder blades and the upper trunk. With the lower and upper limbs, we lift the load above the trunk. The trunk must be kept fully stabilized and firm at all times. These principles apply subsequently to all movements. When done correctly in leg press, the pelvis and lumbar spine should remain in a neutral position, but the lower limbs carry out flexion and extension in an isolated movement. When the hip joint reaches 120 degrees while performing leg raises with a medicine ball, the pelvis is disengaged and the load is transferred from the sacrum to the area of the upper lumbar and lower thoracic spine. The pelvis and lumbar spine raise above the mat, while increased intra-abdominal pressure helps the abdominal muscles pull the pelvis towards the chest. The upper half of the body remains flat on the mat, providing stabilization. Errors and decentration of the joints in these exercises present with asymmetrical muscle tension of the lower extremities. In the case of incorrect stabilization of the trunk, we can observe unbalanced activities in the thigh muscles, which appear particularly in the straight head. The client will indicate a burning sensation in this location. In the 3 months position on our backs, we can use various equipments, aids, or tools with numerous combinations of upper and lower limb movements. Here we can see the upper limbs actively pulled into extension, followed by the movement of the lower limbs without disconnecting the upper and lower trunk. This is done while maintaining the cylindrical shape of the abdominal wall. Let's review the most common mistakes that can be observed in the position during this exercise. The abdominal wall loses the cylindrical shape and the pelvis tilts forward or backwards. Additionally, the chest loses its neutral position. We call this disengagement or loss of the centrated position, which means incorrect trunk stabilization. The picture on the left shows the correct barrel or cylindrical shape, while on the right we see the unbalanced activity of the abdominal muscles. The upper part of the rectus abdominis muscle is under higher tension and slopes the navel, which then faces upwards. Frequently, an imbalance can be seen in the oblique abdominal muscle with increased activity in the upper part. Skin wrinkles, lines, depressions, or diastasis appear on the abdominal wall as a consequence of the loss of cylindrical shape. During the decentration in the shoulders, we observed increased activity in the upper portion of the pectoral muscles. On the left, we see complete activity in all the fibers of the pectoral muscle, and on the right, we can specifically see the fibers of the upper portion being overloaded. This is often associated with increased tension in the upper segment of the trapezius muscle. In the cervical spine, this decentration is manifested by the backwards tilt of the head. In the hip joint area, uneven tension on the thighs appear during decentration. Very often, increased tone in the straight thigh muscle can be observed. It is still necessary to keep in mind that the loss of centration in one segment will lead to decentration within the whole system and lead to the manifestation of muscle imbalance. In each phase of the movement, the joints must be centered in order for the movement to be performed correctly, even with a higher load. 3-month abdominal position, and lifting to 6-month and back. The 3-month prone position is a position we use mainly for the reinforcement of the correct support for the upper limbs, straightening of the thoracic spine, and maintaining a stable trunk. It is the basis of all subsequent exercises, such as push-up or plank. As a first step, we must engage this centered position. First, the client will support themselves on their elbows and then transition to the whole arm. While being supported by the whole palm, the middle fingers should be pointed forward. The fingers are spread apart so that the weight of the body is evenly distributed from the thumb to the pinky finger. In the second step, we activate the stabilization system with an instruction: inhale into the abdomen and increase pressure on the hips and groin. This will assist the client to activate the abdominal muscles while preventing the pelvis from tilting forward and the lumbar spine from bending backwards. Then instruct the client to push into their palms of their hands. This way we stabilize the shoulder blades and straighten the thoracic spine properly. Instruct the client to spread apart their shoulder blades and to put their head in a neutral position. During the pushing portion, the elbows will begin to extend, lifting the body as a single unit off the ground. It is important not to lock or bend the elbows too much. The shoulder blades are pressed against the chest in a neutral position, rendering the inner edges of the scapula parallel to the spine. The thoracic spine should not bend towards the ground or be arched towards the sky, but stay in line with the shoulders and heels. The chest and pelvis are in a centered position and should form a barrel. When performing a push-up, we can either use the modification with the support on the knees or a more difficult variation with lifting onto the toes. Muscles in the front of the body work in coordination with the rest of the body to maintain the position so that the chest does not drop and the head is in line with the rest of the body. They then transfer their weight forward onto their hands and then back onto their knees. This is referred to as the swinging. While performing this motion, it is recommended to use aids such as a mirror to observe and to correct the position of their head, chest, and pelvis. The same core structure applies to any centrated position with individual parts of the body in dynamic movement. In the muscles, we can observe balanced activity and through the trunk, a strong barrel. The most common mistakes observed in exercises with upper limb support are loss of centered position of head, chest, and pelvis. The body is bent, the torso is arched, and the pelvis tilts forward. In this position, the balanced muscle tone is lost, and we see too much tension in the paraspinal muscles. This is always associated with incorrect breathing. In this decentrated setting, the diaphragm has no chance to function in proper coordination with the muscles of the abdominal wall. Tightened abdomen and contracted buttocks are another obvious errors of muscle tone balance. In this situation, the spine cannot properly straighten and extend in all directions of the head. Retraction of the shoulder blades is another common mistake. The shoulder blades do not stay in a central position pressed against the chest and tend to travel, most often towards each other and up. Then we see the bad support in the whole upper limb. In the palms, the weight is mostly on the edge of the pinky finger. Fingers are not outstretched, and the elbow is too tight or bent. In the case of poor support on the hands, we can observe that the thoracic spine drops to the ground and the head is tilted. Or on the contrary, that the thoracic spine is too arched and that the client looks down at their knees. Prior to engaging in any movement, the client should always establish the correct posture in the centered position. If the trunk is in a decentrated position, the limbs will also show incorrect stabilization. When the pelvis collapses and the back bends, the support in the knee area changes. The hamstring's tension increases, raising the lower legs. This particular exercise is quite often trained. Yet to achieve correct pelvic stabilization without overloading the muscles on the back of the legs, it is suggested that the lower legs are loosely placed on the mat. With respect to breathing, it is better not to focus on the coordination of respiratory activity with the upward or downward movement. To properly perform this exercise, use a constant slow breathing pattern while focusing on maintaining a centered chest position. This will lead to the proper breathing technique and diaphragm function. When exercising without excessive weight, the client should not need to focus on their breathing. Without breathing corrections, the focus can be on the centrated position of the chest and pelvis as well as the extension of the head. Next, we will review the proper posture concerning the upper limbs. Shoulder blades should be properly aligned. The elbows should move slightly away from the body when moving downwards, while the anterior angle of the elbow should be pointed forward at an oblique angle. The body is supported by the hands with the weight being evenly distributed from thumb to pinky fingers. To transfer the weight from kneeling to the 6-month position and subsequently push up, there are several other variants with aids or increased loads. Balance and sliding pads, suspension systems, or balls can be used. The sliding base can be used for the dynamic movement of the upper limbs, in which the weight is shifted forward while maintaining a stable trunk. This variant is more focused on strengthening the trunk and upper limbs. The same result can be achieved while using the moving roller. We can also use a sliding pad for lower limb dynamic movements where the focus is more on strengthening the trunk and lower limbs. Another variant with a large ball and a table for support allows for dynamic movement. However, if the load brings a loss of good quality muscle coordination, we can decrease the number of repetitions, stop, or go back a step to an easier variant. Optimal trunk stabilization will allow for more efficient strengthening, appropriate body awareness, and ideal coordination patterns, which can be integrated with activities of daily living as well as sports movements. We should always keep in mind that performing the exercise should be with ease and without pain. We get into the bear position by kneeling on all fours. The lower limb support is changing. It transfers from the knees to the front of the foot. We assign this position in development to the period of 14 to 16 months. In the process of verticalization, we can see this position even earlier, when children begin to lift their buttocks in the position on all fours. For the first time, they weight bear on their foot, gathering and interpreting invaluable proprioceptive information. They still have a long way to go before they achieve the so-called real bear. The main benefit of this position is to strengthen the entire trunk. Muscle coordination of the abdominal and back muscles is at its maximum peak. At the same time, the whole shoulder girdle is strengthened. Because the support transfers from the knee to the front of the foot, this position also benefits the development of proper foot and ankle function. In athletes suffering from overload, we can often see limited dorsiflexion in the ankle, shortening of the foot fascia, and the lack of support on the big toe and pinky toe. Exercises with dynamic movement transitions also train physical strength and the centrated positions of all joints. Here we can see the transition from bear to a plank. Maintaining centered position in the joints with the activation of the trunk stabilizers are the basic first two steps necessary to proceed smoothly to the third step: transition to a dynamic movement with one's own body weight. Exercise tools can be used to aid during active dynamic movement in strengthening the whole body. For lower limbs, movement with a large ball increases the demand on the balance and stability components. A sleigh can be used for adding resistance and more significant muscle strengthening. You can also switch to pushing the sleigh with the upper limbs. We attribute the squat to a similar development period when the baby can smoothly move from a bear position to a deep squat and standing up. In a deep squat, the hip joints are at their maximum range of motion. When using a deep squat to relax the hip joints and generate full force when the lower limbs are lifting up the whole body and moving the pelvis from a posterior tilt to a centrated position. This is called straightening of the pelvis above the hip joint. Squats are critical exercises for all athletes, and to prevent injury, we need to follow a few basic rules. As with other movements, we start by adjusting the position and centrating the joints. The legs are set and placed approximately at pelvis width or even a little wider. This depends on the depth of the squat and the type of exercise being executed. The soles of the foot create a 3-point support between the ball of the foot, the little toe, and the heel. This allows for even distribution of weight across the foot. The patella is pointed in the direction of the second toe. If this setting is not maintained, the knee will start to turn inwards and we will see the collapse of the foot's arch. In some cases, the knee turns outwards. The pelvis is in a neutral position together with the chest. The shoulder blades adhere to the chest in a neutral position. They should not be too close together or too far apart, and the shoulders should not be elevated. During the dynamic movement, it is important to pay attention to the knee position and to follow these 3 basic principles. The first principle pertains to the pelvis and chest, which should be in a neutral position. When adjusting the feet to the pelvic width stance, we can achieve a maximum hip flexion of 90 degrees. With a wide stance and keeping the pelvis in a neutral position, we are able to reach a maximum hip joint flexion of up to 120 degrees. If the movement surpasses these angles, the pelvis transitions from a neutral position to the posterior tilt, which is usually unavoidable due to anatomical parameters. We must be aware of what stage of the squat we are in order to achieve the desired pelvic position. Furthermore, the chest and pelvis should maintain a neutral alignment during all 120 degrees of hip flexion. Without proper coordination, we see either a bend in the spine or early pelvic tilt and kyphosis. We can usually see the disrupted muscle control between the front and the back of the torso. Very often, the paravertebral muscles' excessive activity is visible. The second principle is that when squatting without a load, the torso's axis and the shins are almost parallel. and the knees do not extend past the tips of the feet. The position between the torso and the lower limbs changes under a load. Here we can examine a squat with a load on the back. The torso adjusts to balance the load and as a result leans more forward. The correct alignment of the chest and pelvis should always be maintained. When performing a front-loaded squat, the trunk tilts to a more vertical position. The third principle is triple flexion of the joints of the lower limb. During the lowering phase of the squat, all joints, meaning the ankle, knee, and hip, start to flex. This motion should be smooth and controlled. Quite often, this triple flexion is disrupted as a result of the hip joint not possessing the needed mobility. A common issue is that some joints bend too much while others do not bend enough. To restore proper movement in the hip joint, we start with an exercise called half squat. The support is on the knees. The goal of this exercise is to improve the posture and movement of the torso above the hip joint. We train spinal strengthening and global trunk stabilization. After the correct alignment is achieved, the same movement can be repeated with added resistance. For example, resistance bands or pulleys can be used to help strengthen the stabilization of the torso over the upper limbs. We use the pull in various upper limb settings while holding the torso straight above the hip joint. In the beginning, it may be a challenge for the squat to be completed at the proper depth without the heels lifting off the ground. Joint mobility and muscle shortening can also be a problem. In this case, the solution is to start with a shorter range of motion and focus on achieving the deepest squat possible while maintaining proper alignment. When performing a loaded squat, proper form is necessary for a safe and controlled movement. Once we have mastered the basics of squatting, we can start with its variants. Here we see squatting with a load. This can be done with a barbell or other devices. The optimal load increases muscle strength faster when using the correct movement patterns. Squats are one of the hardest and also most demanding exercises to perform correctly. The joints are at risk of being forced out of the proper movement pattern. When monitoring a squat, it is important to notice pain if it occurs. This is a sign that the load is not optimal and without adjustment could result in overloading or injuries. The deadlift is also another variant. The deadlift focuses on the straightening of the hip joint from a deep forward bend where the buttocks remains relatively high. It is important to remember that the knees are slightly bent and not locked. This way, all three lower limb joints can be engaged. The most significant load is going through the hip joint muscles, so it is important to watch the stabilization of the torso and all other joints involved in performing the correct repetitions. One of the other exercise positions is free sitting, which appears in the development during the third trimenon. Sitting is a position we often encounter during the day. Therefore, it is good to include it in training to learn the correct posture and positions of individual segments. If our lower limbs are slightly stretched, we exercise with the torso tilted backward. It is possible to use pulleys and practice in several variants with isolated movements of the upper limbs which represent open kinematic chain training. The forward and backward motion of the upper limbs is also used in training exercises such as rowing. We can also train individual limbs through isolated movements. These phasic movements of the upper limbs should follow the pattern of abduction with rotation of the torso. In addition, one can combine these movements with movements of the lower limbs. The same rules apply to the sitting exercises as to the exercises in the other symmetrical, undifferentiated positions. It is necessary to take care of centrated alignment of the chest, pelvis, neck, and other segments. With poor performance, we will see some clients slip into kyphosis or lordosis in various parts of the spinal segments. During the seated exercises, we can also use a pulley, engaging the upper limbs in full range of lifting motion. This movement is very advantageous since it combines the full range of the shoulder joint with the balanced activity of the torso and shoulder muscles. It is suitable for all types of sports where you need to use the upper limbs while looking up. The shoulder blades often reach upwards and the cervical spine is bent. Both of these incorrect positions should be corrected. In the instructions, it is good first to activate the diaphragm and adjust the torso segments. This should be followed by correct positioning of the shoulder blades. In the beginning, this simple combination and guidance are sufficient to center the dynamic movement of the upper limbs that take place with the balanced activity of all muscle groups. If done incorrectly, we will observe that the shoulder blades move along the chest in all directions, up, down, or sideways. In addition, the core will become unstable. We also need to train arm support function in closed kinematic chain. We start with the lower limbs on a high table loading the upper limbs. In this position, it is most difficult to guard the position of the shoulders and torso. Begin by instructing the client to open their shoulders wide, support their unbent torso, and to lean on their palms while keeping their elbows in full extension. We help center the joints in an active position. Then we are ready to add movements such as transferring light weights forward. After mastering this position, we can move to a complete headstand or handstand. In this variant, the client leans on their elbows or on their outstretched upper limbs. In this position, it becomes challenging to hold the torso because the diaphragm must push against gravity during each breath. Therefore, correction of the rib cage is recommended from the beginning. We can increase the demand by actively removing one leg off the wall and slowly placing it back. Important is to instruct the client to keep the torso in the correct position. After mastering the wall stand, we can progress to the variant in free space. If we flip this position, we achieve the hanging position, which allows us to exercise full range of motion of the upper limbs. While hanging on a crossbar, it is crucial to maintain the correct position of the shoulder blades. This is usually the first step that needs to be corrected in the client. The scapulae should be tightly hugging the rib cage throughout the entire pull-up. The lower angle of the scapula rotates back and forth during the movement, but should be the only movement noted. Therefore, pulling the shoulder blade up or pinching the shoulder blades together is a frequently visible mistake. The exaggerated movement of the shoulder blades over the torso is often due to the insufficient background muscular control. Therefore, it is important to reiterate the basic principles, such as correct adjustment of the head, chest, and pelvis, all while actively engaging the trunk stabilizers. The torso stabilizers and the abdominal muscles connected with the serratus anterior anchor the shoulder blades. The scapulae must stay stable on the chest during movement, only with the rotation of the lower angle. Hanging and lifting can be performed in several variants. The first variant is composed of the hanging position, with the active raising of the lower limbs to 90 degrees. This can also be done on a ladder, where the advantage is being able to support one's back against the wall, leaving only the chest and pelvis to focus on. We should observe the same balanced activity on the abdominal wall as in the 3-month supine position. The abdominal wall is free of depression and lines, while the navel points forward and does not tilt. The groin and the posterior lateral section of the abdominal wall are filled with the intra-abdominal pressure. This deliberate body position is important for all of these exercises. We can use suspension systems where the upper limbs get into a more challenging position for support. We will start with one's feet on the ground and the chest and pelvis in the upright position. Then we will activate the support muscle groups on the upper limbs and will perform an isolated flexion of the lower limbs. In a more advanced variant, the torso will be lifted upwards and the client will continue to hold their lower limbs in flexion. We can use hanging exercise aids in many other variants with the same principles of correction. The torso remains still while the upper limbs move to lift. Tightening the upper limbs in the suspension sleeves is a similar exercise pattern to the parallel bars or the classic pull-up. Dynamic neuromuscular stabilization uses all developmental positions engaged in the process of verticalization as a training positions. In this section, we have shown some undifferentiated symmetric exercise positions. In all these positions, we can practice as a dynamic flow, which you can see in our group exercise section. This training can be used for athletes to prevent injuries and adjust incorrect movement patterns. This can generate extraordinary physical strength, train dynamic movement patterns, increase speed, and master proper movement timing.